Aldrin. For more analysis and some reflection on the day, we're now joined by political analyst Karima Brown. Thanks, Karima.
Hi, good evening.
It's been a very busy day. We've been speaking to our reporters across the country, various issues cropping up repeatedly. Voter turnout, one of the key issues, protests preventing voting stations from opening, the indelible ink question coming up again and again, insufficient ballot deliveries. But now that the counting is about to begin, I want to just take a breather and reflect on the day. What have been your big takeaway points?
Well, I think one needs to put this into perspective. The IEC managed over 22,000 voting stations. The problems that occurred at individual voting stations are real and legitimate, but they have to be put into perspective in terms of scale. So on the whole, the IEC has done a good job, but it has to do some reflection. So, for example, I just asked one of the IEC commissioners why 16 tents were used in a place like the Eastern Cape, where they knew it was going to rain, the tents could be, blown away. Why did they not choose structures that could stand? And he was saying the truth of the moment is that South Africa is an unequal developed society. There aren't many permanent structures in some of those areas, and some of them were not available, like schools or churches and so on. They had made contingency plans. On the indelible ink, there was a really interesting answer. The ink is supplied by a company in India, and its formula is a secret. If you want to remove it, you have to know what the formula is to be able to remove it. What they're going to be doing is they're going to actually go back to the company, and they're going to go to the root source of the matter, and that is what they are going to be sorting out. They also addressed the question of people supposedly voting twice, and there's a series of measures that actually makes that virtually impossible. So the first is the indelible ink. So let's say you manage to get the indelible ink off. There is a zip gun that basically records your barcode, right? You get an ID, and if you're in that particular voting area, your name gets scratched off. So that's the second one, and then of course you vote. But if you want to go to another voting station, you will have to again present your ID. The barcode will be picked up, so they will be able to pick up how many times you voted, where you voted, and they will be able to then cancel that vote out. So the idea that this has happened on a large scale, the IEC has dismissed, but what they have said is that they are obligated to investigate every single complaint. And what they haven't told us, which is actually in the law, is that all the parties have what we call an advisory committee. So if you have serious issues like the African National Congress with the opening of certain voting stations, and you want, let's say, for example, a voting station to stay open beyond the official date, then that is where you take it. And the IEC meets regularly with those individuals, and that is where the problems get sorted out and solved. So we will have to hear over the next few days what the kinds of issues are that some of the parties are flagging. The IEC also said that in some areas, like in Cape Town, for example, where they ran out of ballot papers, one of the reasons why the ballot papers couldn't get from one station to the other is they needed police to escort them, and the police weren't available. So there is certainly room for improvement with other stakeholders. But if you look at the total scale of things, I think the IEC can still kind of get a pat on the back, but there's definitely room for improvement.
I want to pick up on just the explanation around the voting stations in the Eastern Cape, and we have our reporter Avu Mdila, who's there, where people were taken eventually from a tent that collapsed and were made to vote in a home where it wasn't occupied, but that was the only stable shelter they could find. And when the IEC says to us, some of these areas are not resourced enough, they don't even have a school where you could find a stable structure, it speaks, doesn't it, to just the poor quality of life that millions of South Africans still have to endure. So poor a quality of life it is, Karima, that even when people are participating in a democratic process, it still works against them?
Look, inequality in South Africa is our major challenge. We are the most unequal society in the world. So the IEC's explanation that the Eastern Cape is underdeveloped is not untrue. We know that to be a fact. And they can't suddenly manufacture a school just because they're going to have elections. And they have looked at the terrain, and they go there long before the time. So they knew very well that there weren't infrastructure. They also checked, I challenged the IEC. I said, why didn't you go to a tavern, any structure that just hold, or go to people's homes? And he said, we tried various options. The places were also booked. People get married, you can't change that. The church has a function, you can't change that. And in some instances, there were literally no infrastructure. And he said that is a testimony to the inequality of South Africa's spatial planning. I mean, I voted at a bowling alley. It took me less than 10 minutes, to vote. So the truth of the matter is that working class areas, rural communities, their ability to exercise their right to vote is affected by the nature of the inequality of how to get to that vote. In places like KwaZulu-Natal, for example, people were already at the voting stations at 4 a.m. in the morning, only to be told that the IEC is not ready. And that had very little to do with IEC inefficiency. It had everything to do with infrastructure. So the hard realities of South Africa's inequality also played itself out in the way in which poor people were able to access voting. If you were privileged, if you were living in the suburbs, you had an easier time to exercise your democratic right compared to people who lived in places like, the Eastern Cape. The rain also affects people. So many people, for example, would quickly go away and vote at another voting station instead of waiting to go home and to go and stand in a queue where it's dangerous, where it's dark, where there's no lighting, and when it's cold and when it's raining. So those are all factors that need to be taken into consideration. The vote is accessible to us all, but the road to getting to the voting station is affected by the levels of inequality in South Africa. That is just our reality.
You take that and we go back a few minutes to our conversation where Aldrin Sampear was speaking to ANC NEC member Jeff Radebe, who says the ANC has done all it could. It's fired from all cylinders to try and secure a victory in this election. But on that front, it's not just about a victory for the ANC, it's about how big a victory, with predictions of a growing EFF and possibly a growing DA.
Look, the point is that it's pointless for us to speculate now about the polls. People have made their decisions, and we have to now look at the results that comes in. So for me, the key in this election is going to be the party who managed to bring out their voters. So voter turnout is an issue. The big parties are concerned about voter turnout. The African National Congress is concerned, the DA is concerned, even the EFF is concerned. You must remember the EFF is a young party. It doesn't necessarily have the machinery like the DA and the ANC to bring it out. The ANC has been at war with itself. In some instances, you have parties that are offshoots of the Zuma factions competing against the African National Congress. And you must remember, Anli and Tembekile, that this is not just a national election. This is a provincial election as well. So in some people's minds, there is a motive to bring the ANC majority down, because they could then end up being kingmakers. And many of these people have no other qualification except to be politicians. And it's not hard to get into parliament. We've seen that with the proliferation of smaller parties. So I think the provincial dynamics could also change. And you must remember that the DA went around warning people of an ANC-EFF alliance. But the total reality is that it's a Democratic Alliance who's actually in alliance with the DA, with the EFF in the richest metro in Johannesburg, in the administrative capital of Tshwane. And of course, we saw how they turned on their own word and made Mr. Bobani the mayor of Nelson Mandela Bay. And he's a party that received less than 5% of the vote. So coalition governments are a matter of expediency. It has nothing to do with principle. If you look at the policy position of the EFF and the DA, they couldn't be more poles apart. But they work well together because they've worked out a formula that works for them as politicians. elections. And in many ways, some of these other parties will want to copy that rent-seeking approach of the EFF to be able to access state largesse.
And of course, that's a dynamic that we're going to be exploring now as the counting begins and results start trickling in, that everyone's going to be watching that. But before we get to that, what are we going to be watching now in terms of the IEC's processes as the counting process starts?
Well, I think the most important thing is, I was just speaking to one of our reporters in KwaZulu-Natal. She's at the city centre in KwaZulu-Natal, and she says literally the queues are snaking around. There are thousands of young people that have now turned up, and the IEC has assured these people that they will be able to vote, everyone who's in the queue. In other places in the Western Cape, the queues were shorter, and so there are, like Jeff Radebe says, patches where people are turning out in mass. And then, of course, there is still the explanation of 5 voting stations in the south of KwaZulu-Natal that simply didn't open. And, of course, that's depriving people of their right to vote. So we will have to see what that advisory committee says in consultation with the IEC, because that is the body where all the complaints are taken and adjudicated. So the IEC will have to tell us. I spoke with the IEC and said, when can you tell us about voter turnout? And they said that it should be coming through like in the next hour or so. But Ibrahim Fakir, who's a political analyst, said that that is, very optimistic and ambitious from the IEC, because what you have to do is the counting has to happen, the disputes have to be settled, and only after all of that is done. And remember, every party agent signs off on what leaves the voting station. Then you'll be able to see how many people vote compared to how many people were registered. So it's going to be a little while still before we can get to things like voter turnout. All we have now are indications and worries and concerns from political parties about turnout, because they all know whoever had the best machine to get the bums on the seats will be the one in pole position.
And just on that, when you look at the number of voting stations that were either delayed in opening or the 5 that did not open at all, the numbers, some will say, are fairly insignificant. So when we weigh the broader picture, is that likely to be a bigger concern as far as complaints to the IEC are concerned for the bigger parties, or is it the small guys who are going to say, hold on a minute, we're already in such a struggle for this cake that is dominated by the ANC, EFF and DA. You have somehow disadvantaged us by not allowing these stations to open.
Look, politics are about sets of interests. So parties are going to act on what they perceive to be their interests. And if their interests were marginalized as a consequence of voting stations not being open, they are likely to register protest on that. The IEC has to be judged on the scale of things. And that's not to excuse the fact that in some places people were actually literally denied the right to vote. The IEC needs to get that right. It needs to give us explanations, because it reflects on their ability to provide the infrastructure for the election to happen. But if you take the fact that they managed the 22,000 voting stations across the country, then the picture does change, and one can say that the IEC on the whole has carried off a relatively free and fair election as such. But the one thing that bothers me is that if you start slipping on some of the major issues, like, for example, the Act says that political parties need to stop campaigning a certain time. I was in the queue and I was still getting messages from different political parties. The IEC said that's okay because the parties told us that it's automated. Now, for me, that is not okay.
Because you can stop automation as well.
You can stop automation, but more than that, you can instruct your electronic provider to say that we are not allowed to campaign beyond a certain point. President Thabo Mbeki made that point eloquently today. He was asked a question and he said, I'll answer you tomorrow. Legally, I cannot answer you now because it will amount to campaigning. We had our excellent reporter in the Free State who stopped a dear politician in her tracks when she wanted to use an opportunity to campaign and said, sorry, you are not allowed to campaign. So the messages from the IEC must encapsulate both the spirit and the letter of the Electoral Act and the Electoral Code.
Karima, stand by. We are still within what is going to be a very long night here at the National Results Operations Centre, the IEC. Counting has begun in earnest. A lot of people still queuing up to cast their ballots after delays in various parts of the country. Stay with eNCA for all the very latest.